Good afternoon, everybody. We are here today to learn about your respiratory system. This is going to be the first in the series, all about your respiratory system, how it works, the importances of different types of blood gas, acid-base balance, and then diseases of the respiratory system. So let's start with the basics. All right, the respiratory system. What are its functions? What are its jobs? Okay, so what it's most famous for, I would argue, is gas exchange. The gas we would like to go in is oxygen. What you want to get rid of is carbon dioxide. Okay, so that's the function that it's famous for. I would say everybody kind of knows that. But what people don't know is your respiratory system has a humongous role in something called acid-base balance. So as we go through our lectures on the respiratory system, we're going to start with the gas exchange piece and then we'll move into the acid-base piece. Just as a quick kind of overview of what acid-base balance is really all about, for those who don't know, back in A&P1, you talked about the importance of pH. Okay, you want to make sure that you're maintaining pH of different body fluids. One that's very near and dear to us is your blood. And the respiratory system plays a very large role in helping to regulate the pH or the acid-base balance of your bloodstream for reasons that will become clear when we go through this part of the lecture. Okay, so let's get started on the gas exchange piece and we'll talk about the pathway of air in. Okay. So our goal is really to get oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. Right? So we want to keep our main goal in mind when we're talking about the structures of the respiratory system and how this system is put together. In order to do that, we need what's called a gas exchange surface. So we need some sort of surface over which we can exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. Okay, so this gas exchange surface needs to have contact with the outside world, and it does. So when you look across all different species of animals, you see some common themes in gas exchange surfaces. So let's talk about some of those themes right now. Most of them are thin. Okay, it's easier to move oxygen through a piece of tissue paper than it is through a hard surface, right? They have a very high surface area to volume ratio. So we're getting our maximum amount of surface area in the least volume possible. And I'll talk about why our gas exchange surface achieves this in a couple of different ways. And then they have to be kept moist. They have to be kept wet. So the gas exchange surface that we use is kept kind of damp all the time. Now, if you're a fish, this is pretty easy to achieve, all right, for you to stay moist because you live in the water. But if you're a human being, because you've opted to live on land, you've got some challenges associated with keeping your surfaces wet, okay? So they're all thin, high surface area, and wet. Good? Okay. All right, so let's talk about how air gets in. So how do we get air in? What's the pathway? Okay. Air passes through our nose, right? In through the nares and then into your nasal cavity. And then several things happen to the air you breathe in as it enters your nasal cavity. So some of the things would be, it's filtered. Okay, that's what we have nose hair for. That's good. It's going to help clean it up. It's warmed as need be, right? If the air is cooler, when it enters into your nasal cavity, it'll be warmed up a bit. It is humidified. So again, it's made moist. And it is sampled for odor. We smell it. Your sense of smell is called olfaction. Inside your nasal cavity, at the roof of your nasal cavity, there is your major olfactory organ. It's called your olfactory epithelium, and that is where we detect different smells. Okay, we go in through the nose. I just need a little more room. And at the back of the nose, you have a structure called your pharynx. So we're going to go in through the nasal cavity and connect with your pharynx. Your pharynx extends from the back of your nasal cavity past your oral cavity towards your larynx. Okay, so this is what we would call your throat in common terms. Okay, the pharynx will give way to your larynx. This is where your vocal cords are located. Your pharynx is shared. It's a shared space. It's a passageway for air, but it's also a passageway for food. So we're going to talk about the challenge that presents in a second and how we get around that challenge. Okay? Your larynx is then going to go into your trachea, which many people refer to as their windpipe. Okay? Then the trachea branches. So if you have a single trachea, and then it's going to branch because we have two lungs, so we need two passageways to get into those lungs. Those branchings are called your bronchi. Okay? You have a left bronchus and a right bronchus. Collectively, you call them your bronchi. So when these get inflamed, which they sometimes do with allergens or illness or pollution, that's bronchitis. And we're going to talk about some issues in the respiratory system at the very end, but bronchitis means you have inflammation of the bronchi. Okay? Once you get into the bronchi, remember I said one of the things that we needed to achieve at our respiratory surface is we needed to have a very high surface area to volume ratio. So as soon as we get into the lungs, the bronchi are going to do what's called branch. And by doing that, you are taking one large tube and branching off into many, many, many smaller tubes. Those tubes are called bronchioles. So your bronchi will start as primary, which is your largest, then secondary, tertiary. And what's happening is you start to branch out. It's kind of like having a trunk of a tree with many branches coming off of it. You're starting to spread out. Okay? What I mean by smaller tubes is the opening or the lumen of the tube is getting more and more narrow. However, you have a lot more of them, so you're achieving an ability to have a large amount of air moving into the lungs. The bronchioles are going to terminate at a structure called the alveoli. Each lung has millions of alveoli. These are where the action happens. This is your gas exchange surface. So all those other structures I just wrote down, those are just conduits to get to the alveoli. I'm not a big numbers person, but apparently if you were to lay out your alveoli on a flat surface, it would cover roughly the surface of a tennis court, so it's quite large. So it's got a high surface area to volume ratio. It is exceptionally thin, and it is kept moist. So the alveoli are where the action happens, where we're going to have oxygen pass through the tissue, and carbon dioxide is going to come the other way and be exhaled out. So I want to cover, I had said a second ago about having a shared passageway. Okay. So your pharynx is a shared space. Okay. Both air and food can pass through your pharynx. So this presents a problem because you don't want food going where air should go. It's okay if air goes where food should go. That happens all the time. So we have to have a mechanism for making sure that even though this is a shared space, the spaces downstream of them are not shared space. So with air, you're going to move past the larynx into the trachea. Food will be directed into the esophagus. And I'm going to talk about some adaptations of the trachea. The esophagus we'll talk more about when we do the digestive system. So, how do we do this? Your swallowing reflex. When you swallow, okay, a structure called the epiglottis, which is just a flap of cartilage, is going to cover the opening to the trachea, which is called the glottis. So think epi above glottis. You can see how that comes together. So it's almost like this. Here's your trachea. The epiglottis is going to cover the glottis, or the opening to the trachea, and then your tongue will direct food down your esophagus. So what controls swallowing? Swallowing reflex is both involuntary and voluntary. The involuntary part is controlled by the medulla, which is part of your brain. So what happens when something goes down the wrong tube? Well, it's because you decided to drink and talk at the same time, or laugh hilariously at the same time, and then little bits of, say, water or a little crust of food goes down your trachea. What you do to get it out is you start coughing violently. And at first people go, oh, went down the wrong tube, you okay? And you're coughing and coughing, but when the coughing continues for another 5 minutes, you're just kind of a little embarrassed. Now, unfortunately, sometimes a big wedge of food gets stuck at the opening of the trachea, at the glottis, and then we got a problem. Then you're choking. When someone is choking, it means that a piece of food is obstructing air from getting past the glottis into the trachea and making it into your lungs. So not only are you now not getting oxygen in, you're not getting carbon dioxide out. When someone does the Heimlich maneuver, they're using pressure that's in your lungs to kind of force air with enough pressure, we hope, to dislodge whatever has been directed down the trachea. This is why we don't talk and eat or talk and drink at the same time, and we chew our food, and we don't take gigantic bites and inhale our food, because you will risk choking. If it stays stuck in there for any more than 4 or 5 minutes, you're not in a good place, for sure. Okay, let's talk about the alveoli. Okay, I had said they were thin. They are a single cell layer thick. They are squamous epithelial tissue, which means that the cells themselves are very flat and thin. Now, I did mention that they are kept wet, they're kept moist. So if you've ever taken a piece of Kleenex and you put some water on it, what happens? It falls apart, right? So this is going to present a challenge. We need the cell layer to be very, very thin to facilitate gas exchange, but because we already agreed, now you can't go back, that the surface had to be kept wet, theoretically the surface tension of water, could crush the alveoli. So that's a problem, and we have a get around, so don't get too nervous, okay? You have 2 different types of cells in the alveoli. You have type 1 and you have type 2, okay? Type 1 are the cells that are exclusively for gas exchange. The type 2 cells produce something called surfactant. Okay, sometimes the term is called pulmonary surfactant. So I'm going to tell you the story of pulmonary surfactant and why it's super important. Once upon a time when you took A&P1, you should have learned that water has some very specific properties. One of the properties that water has is it has surface tension. Water molecules like to stick together. If you want to disrupt them and break them apart and kind of get them to separate, you usually have to put in some energy to make that happen. For example, if you take liquid and you want it to go to steam, you got to boil it, which costs you energy in the form of gas coming out of your stove. So we want to do something to break up that surface tension of those water molecules. So we're going to introduce something called surfactant. Surfactant, which is produced by the type 2 cells of the alveoli, is a detergent-like compound, and what it's going to do is kind of disrupt the cohesiveness of water molecules, which is a lot of fancy talk, right? This is a lot of fancy talk for saying it's separating the water molecules and reducing some of that tension. So essentially now, because of the presence of surfactant, this will help prevent lung collapse. Which is handy. You don't want your lungs to collapse. When a baby is born with underdeveloped lungs, they say they can't breathe on their own yet. It's usually because if the baby is born prematurely, they're not producing their own lung surfactant. So what happens then is as soon as the baby is born, you notice they become cyanotic. They become blue because not only can they not get oxygen in, they can't get carbon dioxide out. So obviously you would ventilate the baby first, but the treatment for this, when a baby is born prematurely, one of the things they will monitor for is lung development. But if a baby is born with underdeveloped lungs, obviously you would ventilate first, and then you would give a hormone called cortisol. And we remember when we studied cortisol in the endocrine system, cortisol does a lot of things in the human body, but one of the things it does is it will allow for surfactant production. So when they say they're giving somebody steroids to allow them to produce surfactant, this is the steroid that they're talking about, prednisone. Prednisone is synthetic cortisol. Okay, the next time we meet, we're going to talk about how we breathe and the mechanics behind it.